the impact of social media and social networking on political regimes. Welcome also to those of you who are watching us on a live stream. And I'd like to remind you that you could send questions either to our Twitter account at @Lato_LV or to our Facebook account, Facebook.com/Latvian Transatlantic Organization. Less than a year ago, on the 17th of December, in a small, obscure town in the middle of Tunisia, Mohamed Bouazizi was harassed by the local police. He took this very much to heart. He was incensed. He went to protest. Nothing happened. And he set himself on fire in front of this town's city hall. 5 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, nobody would have noticed. But his friends started writing about this on Facebook. And this became the, perhaps spark would be not the right word to use, but in any case, this became the impulse that launched the Arab Spring. Now, 10 months later, the authoritarian ruler of Tunisia is gone. Mubarak in Egypt is gone. We are seeing how protests are continuing in Syria, also using social media to tell the world about what's happening there. So we have seen that social media can have a profound effect on countries and on the geopolitics of one of the most important regions in the world. At the same time, over the last years, we've seen that social media, hyped as a tool for social change, has not affected that change as it had been hoped. We saw that in Iran, and at present, up until now, at least in Syria, the messages we're getting from Syria are not contributing have not led to the fall of the regime that many hoped for. And in the West, these kind of social interactions, while many of us partake of them and many of us see them as a part of everyday life now, they can lead to results that are questioned as to their usefulness and how and whether Western countries shouldn't start pulling back. The riots in London recently, and of course the ongoing discussions about WikiLeaks and what that means for governments and for openness and for journalism. To discuss these questions, we have a very distinguished panel that I think will allow us to look into the various aspects of this. We have Dr. Saeed Sadek, who is a professor of political sociology at the American University in Cairo, also a pro-democracy activist, and someone who took part in these changes in Egypt. We have Mr. Spencer Boyer, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs and responsible for public communication and public diplomacy. We have Ms. Joanne Jacobs, who's a London-based social media consultant who has extensive experience in consulting both on the use of social media and on cybersecurity and what that means and how we make the trade-offs between openness and using these in a way that keeps us secure. And finally, Mr. Ojārs Kalniņš, who is the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Parliament of Latvia. He was also Latvia's ambassador to the United States for many years, but he started his career in public relations, and he's seen how this media landscape and how it influences politics and change has changed over a number of decades. I'd like to start the discussion with Mr. Sadek, and I'll give him a little more time because I think it's fascinating to hear how these media actually influence things, and also to tell us a little bit about what were the preconditions in Egyptian society and Tunisian society that allowed these social networks and the internet to be such an influential force in political and social change. Mr. Sadek, please.
Good evening to you all, and I'm very happy to be here in Riga. Let me start first by saying that media are a very important tool in politics. The heart of politics is media. If you don't have media, you don't have any politics. You can talk about electronic media, you can talk about print media. The new media that emerged are called social media because they empower the people to be interactive. Instead of you sitting at home, you watch TV and you are only a receiver, passive consumer. With social media, you interact, you pose topics, you put the agenda, and you have discussion, and you create a virtual political community, especially in societies that are suffering from dictatorship. If you have a dictatorship, One of the important tools they control is the media. They control what you see and what you know. What are the facts? They tell you what are the facts. So social media, you begin to challenge the official version of what is happening. And not only that, assenting, dissenting with what is happening, but also beginning to organize and rebelling in the end. And so the social media that were introduced in the area began, in addition to the satellite TV transmission and the internet, a public forum for the whole world to contribute. The governors, the rulers, the opposition, even terrorists. You see Al-Qaeda is also using the internet. Everybody is using it according to their own political objectives. In the Arab world, because of high illiteracy rate, people depended mainly on satellite TV. But very well-informed public opinion, the youngster, 65% of the Arabs are young people, between 15 to 35. And they began to enter the internet, smartphones, and you know, they use all this equipment, whereas their leaders were not as active or updated. The site of President Mubarak, for example, was still under construction for a long time. You know, when people were, you know, that speaks volumes by itself. In the last 10 years, there were many labor strikes in the country and organized mainly through normal channels, opposition press. And then they began to put it on Facebook. Pages are made and nobody can touch it. And it's so complicated because the server are outside. And anyway, the government in the beginning underestimated the power of social media. Until 2008, there was a labor strike in an industrial town. And one lady said, why don't we combine this industrial strike with a nationwide strike because of the prices, corruption, and stuff like that. And she put a page on Facebook calling on the Egyptian people to strike. Nobody took it seriously. And some of the government press even mocked it, and they began to publicize it. And so people, hey, there was a Facebook page that says, let's have a strike. So in that way, they spread the word even further. You know, I have a country of 85 million people. How many are subscribers to the Facebook? 6 million. Twitter, 500,000. Internet, daily use, Hotmail and whatever newspaper, 20 million. But not many people went to this Facebook page. But the government media publicized it. And so everybody knew about it, and many began to respond, and it was a success. In fact, when it succeeded on the 6th of April 2008, a group of youngsters emerged calling themselves the 6th of April movement. And they began to call for other demonstrations through Facebook. If you have a dictatorship, it always rules through a divided society, fomenting sectarianism, scaring people of politics. People were talking about politics in Egypt are dead. Because you cannot organize. There are many laws that would prevent you from organizing in reality. But you can organize virtually through Facebook, through Twitter, through internet sites. So many began to organize pages criticizing the government, creating a counter-political community that was emerging day by day. And the government, again, ignored it. And they thought it was something stupid. But then when the 2008 Facebook strike succeeded, they began to form a digital detective corps. Their job is to monitor Facebook and what is being you know, posted, what are the topics, the agenda, what are the public opinion views. In fact, when we have the revolution and people would storm the state security building, they discovered that files containing usernames, passwords, because they can get into the IP address and get your file and know what is going on. Still, it continued, and nobody even bothered about what is happening, because you still can put a lot of stuff and you can do nothing about it. Human rights violation was increasing in the country, and this is one of the main reasons you had the Arab Spring. Upper class, middle class, lower classes were suffering from the security. I have in Egypt 1.5 million policemen, in addition to 500,000 army. In addition, NATO, EU, and the US and Israel supported those autocratic regimes. Who are you to challenge such regimes? Despite all those challenges, we began to form cadres that began to use Facebook and benefit from creating a virtual political community away from the government influence. The government can say whatever they like in the media, and they put any version of their choice, but we would put something and we had more credibility. One day in the summer of 2010, before the revolution, the Egyptian police killed a man in broad daylight. His name was Khalid Said, and they said he committed suicide. This is the official version. A page was made immediately on Facebook. It attracted 1 million in a few hours, because a lot of people were not happy with what is happening, and they began to break the culture of fear. This police state, this intelligence state can be broken, because when you put I like on any page, you are making a big step. You are becoming politically active. And instead of you going to the street and you are scared the police would arrest you, what you do at your own home while drinking coffee, like. And that's enough. It tells me about the size of public discontent in the country. When we had demonstrations in the street, if I send 200 people, the Egyptian police would send 5,000 policemen. I just visited the Museum of Occupation here just briefly, and I saw how the Soviet Union invaded Latvia, 300,000 soldiers, and then they faced 16,000 Latvian soldiers, so the die was cast. So they immediately ended the war and capitulation. It was something similar. That was the tactic being used by all Arab police states. They would overwhelm you with police, and then you are very small. So it was very important that we organize what is called smart mob, smart crowd, smart demonstrators. How did we do that? Twitter and also the smartphone that we have, we can organize in seconds where we go and where to attack, and we did the reverse of what the government used to do. Let me give you an example. On the 18th day, the day in which Mubarak resigned, we had a Twitter, everybody was calling the people to go and to Tahrir. We had the biggest representation of people, critical mass in any revolution in history, 18 million people. This didn't happen. The Iranian Revolution had 3 million people in the street of Tehran. We had 18 million people. Imagine, not only in Cairo, but in also other places. When we were going to Tahrir, we looked at Twitter, and it says, Tahrir is full. We need people to go to the TV building. So we moved all to the TV building. And in this way, many smart crowds were being organized, overwhelming the 1.5 million policemen. In 4 days, the system collapsed. Technically, they were staying in the street for 4 or 5 days without recharging the walkie-talkie. Then the government didn't know what to do. They knew that we are using mobile. So what did they do? They cut off the mobile connection. They knew that we are using internet. They pulled the plug on internet in the entire country. And that shows you the power of social media. Had they not been important, they wouldn't have done that. They knew that this is happening because of the power of social media. People began to organize, and they began to mobilize, and they began to act. It is not only enough that I make you form a position or take a view on an issue, but I also mobilize you to take an action. And the action, we directed you toward the action with special pages that were put on Facebook, and also tweets Twitter that would tell everybody. But what about the people who did not have access to the internet, who are ignorant and illiterate? We began to have, some of those movements that were active, they began to stage plays, fake plays in the street. So how is that? They would go to a coffee shop, you'll find 100 people unemployed, youngsters, and then they find a quarrel. What are you doing? I'm immigrating. Why? Please don't immigrate. No, there is no job. There is nothing in this country. I have to immigrate. Please wait until the 25th of January. Something will be happening and all your problems will be solved. No, I don't believe you. Please believe me this time. Okay, I believe you. And they go. The guys who are sitting in the coffee shop, they watch this event. What is that? What is 25th of January? What are they talking about? They would do the same thing. They go to the underground. People with a camera, and then they take the train, and it's overcrowded, and then they come and interview as if this is a TV interview. What do you think will happen on the 25th of January? I hope things will be okay. Really, but Egypt will be a big explosion. Yeah, but it will be for the best thing. Okay. And then they leave. Then they take the other train, and they do the same trick. And so people, this is an oral tradition. So people were passing by and conveying what happened. You would take a cab, and then you pretend that you are receiving a phone call. Okay, I know the country will be totally closed on the 25th of January. Yeah, the police will collapse. Yeah. So the cabbie who is driving, and he takes many passengers every day, he begins to, what is that? Who is this strange passenger that he has online? And so they began to spread the idea all over the country that something big is going to happen on the 25th of January. And that's how we have used social media in general in Egypt to make the revolution, and how we used nonviolence. We used the latest technology, and as you have seen, it spread. Tunisia did it. In fact, what is happening in Syria, you could not have seen it without Nokia disconnecting the people from the government. It was, all the films that you are seeing from Nokia. Imagine if it didn't exist, he would have wiped out all the opposition like he did in 1982 in Homs and Hama in Syria. Nobody knew about it. 30 to 40,000 people massacred like Tiananmen Square and others, and finito. And so thanks to the social media, and we had a poster during the revolution, big posters, billboard in the streets near Tahrir, thanks to Facebook. Thank you.
That's a very good place to stop. This is introduction. Thank you. We'll go now to Spencer Boyer, who's a representative of the U.S. State Department. I know Hillary Clinton has made internet a priority for the State Department. You do public diplomacy. First of all, how does the United States see how it can influence these kind of movements for the better that we just heard about? And second of all, how does it see how it is a player in this new media field?
Well, thanks, Paul, and thanks to the organizers for giving me an opportunity to speak today about the State Department's approach to social media, social networking, in a time, I think, of tremendous change in the world, and how we see it impacting on political regimes. As a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs in our European and Eurasian Affairs Bureau, I, of course, see things through a transatlantic prism, but I do know that all of our work on social media, on social working, on internet freedom is closely coordinated through all of our bureaus throughout the department, as well as through the interagency, and we work very closely in my bureau with Secretary Clinton's senior advisor for innovation and technology, Alec Ross, and his people. So let me begin, actually, Paul, with three of the top policy challenges that we see are posed by social media. I think these challenges were laid out very, very well by Secretary Clinton earlier this year in her Internet Freedom speech, which echoed and built upon her groundbreaking Internet Freedom speech of January in 2010. I think that her speeches and the ideas regarding the challenges capture well how we view the importance of advancing freedoms made possible by new technologies, and provide, I think, a useful framework for how we evaluate developments around the world. The first of these challenges is maximizing liberty and security. I think it's important to note that the Secretary often doesn't use the term balancing, which is a term that we often hear. The difference is that liberty and security are often posed as equal and opposite. The more you have of one, the less you have of the other. But I think in the end, they actually make each other possible. Without security, liberty is fragile. Without liberty, security is oppressive. The challenge I think we all face is finding the proper measure of security to enable our freedoms, but not so much or so little as to endanger them. Finding that measure is particularly important because of the qualities that make the internet a tool, I think, for extraordinary progress in terms of the speed and the reach of the internet, which also, I think, enables the possibility of terrible wrongdoing on the internet in terms of spreading child pornography or human trafficking rings, organizing online, terrorist networks being able to connect more effectively. So it is a double-edged sword. The second challenge we see is protecting transparency and confidentiality. As the term consent of the governed can only be meaningful if citizens understand the workings of their governments, I think our core principle of government openness and information disclosure extends to online channels. But in addition to being a public space, as we know, the internet is also a channel for millions of private communications all of the time. And governments must protect privacy and confidentiality in order to provide for citizen security. In our foreign policy, the work of negotiating agreements, promoting the cause of human rights and democracy around the world would be terribly crippled if we couldn't make some of our efforts confidential, if we had to make public every step that we do. We've seen this play out very publicly in the WikiLeaks debate, which I'm happy to go into in our question and answer session if people are interested. The third challenge is protecting free expression while fostering tolerance and civility. As the Secretary observed, despite the fact that the internet provides a unique space for building building bridges between people and their differences and building trust and understanding, the internet can also be a tool for spreading intolerant speech, which is often impossible to retract and amplified very quickly on the internet. I think this is especially true with social media, which makes ideas and arguments easy to access, easy to spread, I think to an extent that was unimaginable maybe even 10 years ago. We certainly don't have the answers to all of these questions, but we actively work with our European allies across the board on how to address these challenges effectively without constricting openness to the internet and our concepts of freedom of expression. We track terrorists and other criminals online. We attempt to make our government processes as transparent as possible without exposing people to risk or hurting our effectiveness in what we do. We expose offensive and hateful speech to the light of day where we think it tends to wither, and combat it with more speech and open debate and so on. I think our guiding principle is that the freedom of expression, assembly, and association online are paramount, or what we call the freedom to connect. We believe that the more freely information flows, the stronger societies become. Access to information helps citizens hold governments accountable, generates ideas, encourages entrepreneurship and creativity, and many other positive things. So turning to the specific events of this year, as we analyze the rapid developments in the Middle East and North Africa, obviously there's lots of thoughts, lots of commentary about what happened, what's going to happen next, and so forth. But I think one thing is abundantly clear. It was about much more than the internet. People protested as my fellow panelist here mentioned, because of deep frustrations with the political and economic conditions in their lives. The internet didn't demonstrate and march and take a stand and take risks. People did all of that. And as the Secretary noted, what they did was inspiring, not because of the fact that they used Twitter. It was inspiring because people came together and persisted in demanding a better future for themselves. I think it's easy to be misled by all of the numbers in terms of Twitter followers or YouTube hits and so forth. But it's really not about that. It's not about the numbers. It's not about going viral. I think it's about the impact that technology has on our lives and how people can use these tools effectively when people are already inspired to try to make a difference. So in the end, the Arab Spring wasn't a revolution about technology. Social media, of course, accelerated the Arab Spring. It made it more powerful in a lot of instances, but it didn't create it. Youth unemployment, dissatisfaction with ruling families, high food prices, other things, I think, caused the dissent movements to emerge. And we believe that countries that attempt to curtail internet freedom by blocking content, intimidating people from expressing their ideas, or otherwise putting up walls won't likely succeed forever. You know, human ingenuity, we believe, will triumph in the end, and that governments who try to do it or block part of the internet that they don't like are mortgaging away their future in terms of less innovation, less access, and less innovation, and often spurs more government corruption. The Secretary calls this the Dictators Dilemma, you know, trying to separate the internet out into different parts, a social internet, a economic internet, a political internet. There's only one internet, and you can't shut down any one part. So to wrap up, you know, what does the State Department do? You know, how are we kind of feeding into this whole process to further the openness of the internet and connectivity? I think here we do have a really good story to tell. You know, we're hitting it from a few different vantage points. You know, we reach out to governments that have breaches of internet freedom through traditional diplomacy, diplomatic channels. We reach out to other countries, raise the cases of imprisoned bloggers and journalists and activists at the highest levels of government. We also speak publicly about it. You know, last year we publicly raised the cases of online activists and journalists in countries ranging from Egypt to Tunisia to China to Syria to Azerbaijan. We're developing policy. The Secretary has something called the Net Freedom Task Force, which develops a policy framework for planning and implementation of our internet freedom agenda. We also have the Secretary's 21st Century Statecraft Initiative, which is designed to take 21st century tools and use them in furtherance of our foreign policy challenges. We also work through multilateral fora. At the upcoming December OSCE ministerial meeting in Vilnius, we're working on a consensus that affirms that fundamental freedoms and human rights apply to access to and use of the internet and other digital media. We're expanding monitoring and reporting. You know, we are trying to make sure that we effectively are monitoring threats to internet freedom worldwide and use that data to make better policy decisions. We've also increased the training of our foreign service officers to acquaint them with internet freedom issues. And last but not least, you know, we spread technology and expertise. We've supported the development of new technological tools. We've given tens of millions in competitive grants to technologists and activists working on the cutting edge of internet freedom issues and fighting against internet repression. It involves both technology, enabling users to circumvent controls and break through firewalls, as well as training for journalists, civil society leaders, and ordinary citizens to give them the tools to get their messages out and protect them from security threats. So I'll end there.
Thank you. Thank you, Spencer. Van Jacobs, we heard Mr. Boyer say that liberty and security should reinforce each other. Do you see is there a trade-off between these two, or are these things that are sort of, we can't have enough of both of them?
Liberty doesn't reinforce security. Sorry, no, I will respond to that, yeah. I think, in the course of what I'm actually about to say. Thank you for having me. I'm the token technologist on the panel, so I used to be a programmer and I used to be a hacker. And I have been involved in this sort of era for quite some time. I'm also from the same part of the world as Julian Assange. Make of that what you will. I'm sure I'm the only Australian in this conference anyway. Look, social media, we talk about this. There's a lot of people who are talking about the opportunities of social media to bring about change and to do wonderful good things for society. Certainly, things go viral when they are in the public interest. Where people feel that there is a social benefit, things will go viral. Ultimately, though, social media are just tools. They facilitate faster access to information that is produced by a much wider diversity of voices, and more to the point, they give equal voice to all participants. So it's not just organisations and authorised media authorities. It is, in fact, anyone in the street who has an opinion. There is also the issue that all of these things are in fact not what makes social media compelling. What makes social media compelling is just how low tech it is. It's very easy to adopt. Because it's easy to adopt, it's very easy to bypass any systems that are put into place. Trying to control social media is pointless. Anyone thinking that they can stop communication through various networks by cutting off the internet access in Cairo or cutting off the internet access in Tunisia, we just bypassed it. We just found different ways of communicating using these same tools. You cannot stop these technologies. You cannot stop groups of people, whether they are involved in public interest ideas or whether they're involved in doing organised crime, utilising these technologies. Very recently I was in London during the London riots. By the way, for those of us who were in the midst of it, really, yes, okay, it was a serious issue and there was lots of property damage and there were some lives that were lost. But for those of us living through it, really didn't affect us that much. Lots of sirens in the streets. Other than that, we just went about our daily lives. In fact, there's been a lot of conversation in the media about the London riots being organised by groups of malcontents online. No, they were using BlackBerry Messenger, which is a private communication system, not a public one. So social media was in fact used after the London riots to help clean up the streets. So this goes back to this public interest idea that social media is in fact most useful when it is actually supporting public interest ideals. So that's what makes social media compelling. It's the low tech and easy to send in spite. I mean, it's the internet. It was designed to root around damage. So the whole point is this low tech technology, which is easy to spread information, is going to be able to access whatever systems are available to it, and you cannot stop it. So what impact does that have on social media and political regimes? Well, yes, you can actually see lots of beautiful examples of really great, wonderful things that societies that have been subject to oppressive regimes have been able to rise up against. You have also seen the rise of WikiLeaks and Anonymous. I'm always amused by organisations that focus on what program and what policy can we do to address WikiLeaks. What program can we install? You can't. These people are classical anarchists. Not anarchists in the way that the media actually describe them, but people who are, by their very nature, resisting programs. They are resisting participation. So if you as a government official went up to somebody who you knew was a member of Anonymous, they would always reject your approaches. This is the nature of these technologies. It's not that the technologies themselves that are wrong or evil or that you can actually change them. They are just there. We should stop thinking about social media as a process for utopian governments. It's not a thing that you have to control. It's simply there. And the more that we actually start to actually use social media as just part of our normal communication systems, we'll be more likely to produce the kind of end goals that we're actually interested in looking at. So what sort of impact does that have on cybersecurity? My colleague in London just a couple of weeks ago, Ben Hammersley, addressed the Information Assurance Advisory Council, and his advice to the council was the most underrepresented threat across the world is in terms of cybersecurity. we've said it before in the course of the last day or so, that Al-Qaeda and that China and all of these other issues and military action are all a threat. They are none of them as important as the threat of cybersecurity. And unfortunately, Chatham House, which has released a report this week saying that the UK's response to cybersecurity, whilst it was initially interesting, 650 million was put aside for cybersecurity, and only a fifth of it has been spent on infrastructure. What we need to do is to provide free access. You're not going to stop it, so your best way of dealing with it is facilitating it. Because the more voices who are participating, the more likely it is that you can get your messages out there, because you're going to be competing with each other. At the moment, there is a section of the reason why the success of a lot of these campaigns, these great, wonderful campaigns in the Arab Spring have been successful, is because the people who are participating in these technologies belong to a certain demographic. The more people who are participating, the more voices there are. So in some respects, it could be bad for public interest campaigns, because you're going to have more voices, it's going to be harder to be heard. But effectively, providing access and ensuring that the infrastructure is safe and it's accessible across geographical boundaries is where your greatest opportunity to ensure the success of the safety and success of your people. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. And finally, Mr. Kalniņš, Ojārs, I think many people in this room remember when CNN was a world-changing technology. You remember people holding up signs, "The world is watching." This was going to change politics forever.
They watched, but they just ignored it afterwards.
Well, in some places they did. I mean, but here in Latvia, that was very important. The video from the January before the barricades was quite important in providing support for Latvia at that time. You've seen these changes. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how you see the balance shifting between internet and old media, quote-unquote old media.
Yes, thank you. This might age me a little bit, but back in 1970, there was a black American poet named Gil Scott Heron who had a hit single called "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised." This was actually a recited poem with some background music. It predated hip-hop and rap. But in the 70s, which was also a time of unrest in the U.S. and elsewhere, this became a big hit. And when I was looking at some of the articles that have been written about social media, I noticed a lot of them started with this line, "The revolution will not be televised," but it was always followed up by, "No, it will be tweeted, texted, blogged, and organized by Facebook." Now this is true to a certain extent, but television's role has not gone away, it has changed. There was a time when we had a TV where we went to watch entertainment, then we went to our PC to write documents or send emails, and then we went to our mobile phone to call a friend. Today, all of that is in one package. Basically, our smartphones are television sets, they're word processors, they're PCs, they're communication devices. And this has changed television. So the question is YouTube television? If it is, then revolutions are being televised today. And I think, as you mentioned with CNN, there was a time when people said that if it wasn't on CNN, it wasn't news. But I think a station like Al Jazeera has totally changed that. We hear a lot about this is no longer a unipolar world. The United States is not the only global player. We have China, India, Brazil, Russia. I think the same is true in television and global communications. It's not only Al Jazeera, it's other Arabian news services. Each country has their 24-hour news service. And what's interesting is that television now is incorporating the social networks. CNN has iReports. They have people sending in their reports. In January of this year, Nick Gowing of BBC was in Riga giving a lecture. And he basically said that we have all become reporters. We each have a phone, we could take pictures, we can record a news event and send it out much faster than any news reporter can because they're not there. And so the TV networks have begun to rely on that. And more, if you watch television news, not only are they relying on viewers' news reports, they're soliciting emails, they're reading emails, and now almost every talk show has these questions where you can call in your responses by mobile phone. So television has become interactive. And in that sense, even TV is supporting unrest or revolution. But the idea behind Gil Scott-Heron's poem was he was trying to condemn passivity, inaction. And I will read another line from the poem, and that is, you will not be able to stay home, brother. You will not be able to plug in, turn out, and cop out. Turn on and cop out. Well, the interactive social media has changed that because you can stay home, you can plug in, but now you can log on. And you can, even from your home, as we've heard from our other speakers, you can actively engage in social activity. But what fascinated me, and this has started to come up, is can this be stopped? Can this be blocked? And as was mentioned, there was an attempt in Egypt to cut off all internet. And there was a recent Yale study that indicated that actually by cutting off internet, you are exacerbating social unrest. You are sending people out into the streets. And there are three good reasons for this. First of all, it alerts non-political people to a problem. You go into your internet, you want to go Skype your cousin or see what's on eBay, your internet isn't working. You start asking around what's happening, and you find out that there's been a total cutoff in the country. Second, not having access to news increases anxiety, fear, paranoia. You start to believe that maybe things are really worse than they are. And finally, you have to go out on the street to see what's happening. And as I understand it, then Libya learned from that and realized that a better way to try to control the social media is not to cut it off, but to slow it down. Slowing it down works because people are sitting there waiting for a message to get through. They're kept from going out because they think they'll be able to get through, but they're delayed. Downloads are slowed down. And this leads to perhaps at least my last topic, and that is the danger, because with every new technology there's uses and abuses. And the danger is the increasing ability for not only governments, but commercial entities, interest groups, lobbyists, to manipulate the social media. To start using what started off as an interaction between average people to promote an idea, a cause, but through non-transparent ways. And we see that happening more and more, and I think increasingly political consultants, PR agencies are using Twitter and Facebook to promote their products. And so, yes, we have to start looking at perhaps new legislation to at least promote transparency. And I will give one very current example. As you know, we have an election today in Latvia. Now, according to Latvia's election law, all political campaigning had to stop at midnight on Thursday. So we couldn't distribute posters. All posters had to be taken down, no political advertising anywhere, basically to allow people 2 days to prepare for the election. But today I was looking at Twitter, and a lot of people were complaining that candidates were using Twitter to continue promoting themselves. There was also a report that text messages have been sent out across the country from parties telling people how to vote. Now, at the moment, there's no law that prevents this. And the law that's trying to control campaigning in the last 2 days prior to the election doesn't cover Twitter, Facebook, or texting. And so these are issues that are going to have to be looked at. We want to promote free speech, and yet we do want to also protect people's interests and control this type of lobbying. So I think with all the opportunities that we've heard about that are offered by social media, just as with the technology end, as soon as you create a new form of security, there is a hacker who figures out a way to overcome that. And at the same time as you create a new social media, there are people out there figuring out how to use that to promote their evil, commercial, or other purposes.
Thank you, Ojārs. Before I open the floor to questions, I have one question that I want to pose, and you can whoever wants to can answer. I think we've seen the impact of social media, and at the same time we've seen that sometimes it doesn't seem to work. I mean, for every Egypt, there's an Iran. For every Tunisia, there's a Belarus right next door to us, where people communicate through this, and it doesn't seem to. What do you think? I mean, how do you see this? What are the preconditions for these media having that impact, or running into a wall?
No, I think you have to understand that media are tools. If there are no revolutionary conditions in the country where the messages are being directed to, there will be no revolution. It can help us, it can facilitate, but if the people do not want to respond or the conditions are not that bad, it will be a failed revolution, aborted revolution from the beginning. So it worked in Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Syria, Yemen, because the conditions are there. In the Gulf, they fed them with money. You know, they give them money. Nobody wants to hit the street and get a bullet. It's different. So we have to be careful about using the social media in any situation. If I call on the Latvian people to have a revolution, if there are no revolutionary conditions, no matter social media I use or TV or whatever internet site, nobody would move.
Any other comments on this? Or?
I agree. I think that there have to be conditions on the ground for that to happen. As I remarked, and I think pretty much everybody on the panel did as well, the internet, social media, social networking can be used for all sorts of purposes. It's a tool for people who are either on the positive side relating to revolutionary change, who are already highly motivated to make that change and use those tools accordingly. But obviously lots of complicated factors go into whether it hits the tipping point or not. But I think the base is whether the conditions are there for it and whether there's enough sentiment to make that change.
Okay. I have a question over here. If we could get a microphone, and then there, and then there, and then the fourth one there. So, if you could please identify yourself before you ask the question. And we had a suggestion from the panel that all questions should be tweet length, 140 characters, but since I can't measure that, I'll just ask you to be brief, to sort of keep in the spirit of that, of tweeting.
Okay, so you may count. I'm Olof Ehrenkvinna I'm senior advisor to the Swedish foreign minister, who was actually the first foreign minister starting to blog. And it got him almost prosecuted those days. People wondered, of course, can you do foreign policy on a blog? And then can you do foreign policy on Twitter? Well, it's perfectly possible. And it creates a much more transparency, which I think is an enormously important thing with regard to international politics. I fully agree with what was said of our friend from State Department here, that the Secretary of State and her engagement in internet freedom has really made a change. And it's quite obvious that there was a shift in American policy with the new administration, where the former American administration put much more emphasis on other issues, like, for example, IPRs. And the new American administration has been more seen it more important to safeguard freedom than to work with a regulatory framework. And I think that is a very, very basic thing to do. We believe, from our point of view in my government, that the human rights approach must be the most important. The basic thing is to preserve freedom on the net, and the security should support the freedom on the net.
So do you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. We know that countries like China and Russia, they have a different opinion about this. What do you think that we should do in order to get a stronger international consensus on implementing human rights on the internet?
Is that for anyone in particular, or whoever wants to answer? Is that for anyone in particular, that question? The panel, the whole panel. Who has a... Should we have conventions, international rules, international interventions to guarantee these internet freedoms?
Net neutrality only. Short answer.
Okay, but
net neutrality is the only thing that we absolutely need to ensure. So there is not a two-tiered level access. This throttling system that you referred to is easy to get over, really easy to get over. I'll go through the details later, but net neutrality is the only thing that we can do. Human rights is produced by people, not by technologies. End of story.
So, international conventions, Mr. Boyer, anything that the United States would...
I think we should focus, from the U.S. perspective, in terms of our messaging on it, communicating with governments in terms of why we see this as important. I think that the first step is getting countries to understand why it's in their interest to have more openness, have more freedom of access, why they're hurting themselves in terms of their ability to be entrepreneurial, stifling creativity, ingenuity, and that in the long run, first of all, that it won't work to keep people down for too long, as other panelists have said. Eventually, ingenuity wins out. People will find a way around. It's only a matter of time. But then secondly, in the short run, even they're hurting themselves. If you're going to look at what countries are prospering, doing well economically, doing well socially, on all measures, there's generally a high level of openness and freedom to connect in those countries. So in my opinion, I think we should start with making sure that countries understand that it's in their interest to do so.
Okay. Ojārs?
Just a short answer. Yes, we should encourage other countries to promote internet freedom, but getting countries with human rights standards that are different than ours to change their human rights standards is difficult to begin with. So to get them to change these will be just as bad. But it's an ongoing struggle that I think we have to pursue. I just want to make another point, since you're from Sweden, and it's another issue about the internet, is I've noticed that several Swedish newspapers have started to block anonymous commentaries in their stories, which is another interesting aspect, because it's something I favor. Because freedom of speech is one thing, but accountability and responsibility, taking responsibility for your words, is something else. And this is another area that I think needs to be looked into. It's up to the free press to determine this, but I think that's important too, because an awful lot of irresponsible things start proliferating on the internet, and people just don't have to account for it.
But anonymity doesn't take away trolling. Trolling happens regardless of whether or not people are anonymous trollers or whether they're identified trollers. Do you know what I mean by trolling?
No.
Maybe you should.
Trolling is when basically people get online and deliberately produce, or in online newspapers, etc., and deliberately produce provocative responses, usually racist, prejudiced responses to posts. And they do that specifically because they're looking for a reaction. It's why it's called the troll. You know, the little troll that used to live under the bridge? That's trolling. So regardless, it's been shown across the board, if you take away anonymity, you increase the possibility of harassment of individuals, and you do not decrease trolling at all.
Even if the individuals can be tracked who are doing
Even
the
if they
trolling?
can be tracked. Because they're just full of themselves. So,
Yep.
Let me add to what she mentioned about trolling, because we have been also, looking at internet use in mobilizing, and we saw the government and some agents would create fake Facebook profiles, and their job is to penetrate some of the pages that are created, and they make this kind of trolling just to provoke everybody. We support dictatorship, we love, I don't know, anything that is shocking, and then it would drain everybody and people will be very angry. And if you look at some of those files, fake names, fake pictures, and it all looks like a fake account. And we got used to this idea about, and it's not only the militia from the government, but also some opposition groups. They have their own militia, electronic militia, and their job is to go to sites that are attacking them, and they pose as somebody, and they make this kind of trolling stuff. So what she mentioned is I see in practice.
Okay, thank you. Next question over here. I'm sorry, yeah. Do we have a microphone?
I'm Ilter Turan from Istanbul Bilgi University. Actually, the first question I had has been partly answered. That is, if we have such a potent instrument of mobilization, it couldn't but be noticed by intelligence agencies, etc., that this is a potential that can also be used to their advantage. And I think Said sort of pointed to this. But the other thing is, it's my understanding that governments, or very powerful governments, monitor all these communications with a view to picking up information. I'd ask the Secretary Boyer if there's any truth to this, or what sort of...
Well, I can't really comment too much on what we might have found in intelligence channels and so forth, but you know, obviously it kind of goes back to the general point that you know, we believe that it's in countries' best interest to allow for truly free freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of association, in the same way online as we have protected it for hundreds of years offline. You know, again, the internet and social media and social networking is just one more step in the continuation of how people express themselves, whether, you know, it started with you know, people speaking in public squares, moving to radio, television, so forth. We've been very consistent in our belief that trying to control it, and if you are trying to monitor what everybody's doing and so forth, my guess is you're trying to control the message in some way. That's probably not a positive thing to do. Obviously, there are always specific reasons, you know, under the full transparency of rule of law, if you need to go on and track somebody because of the fact that there's legal reasons to believe that they are involved in criminal activity and terrorism and so forth, you know, countries can make that decision. But I think that if you do track people, if you are monitoring what people are doing, from a government point of view, there should be some, you know, legal justification to do so.
Yeah, but there's also, I mean, the sheer numbers of interactions that you're actually trying to monitor, trying to find that needle in the haystack of somebody who's actually going to be doing criminal activity. And when it comes to cybersecurity, increasingly people are not actually organising acts; they're just doing them. So even if you did monitor traffic and communication between various identities that you had identified as possibly acting in a criminal fashion, there's no guarantee that they're actually going to mention what they're going to do. There's no guarantee of that at all. It is, to some extent, in terms of cost-benefit, I think you're far better off actually monitoring traffic patterns than individuals. Because if you monitor traffic patterns, you're more likely to find alerts that are happening around a certain region or within a certain network. That's actually more effective than monitoring individuals. I'm sure it does happen, by the way. I'm sure it does happen that people are monitored. Do I care? Not really. Because ultimately, the amount of information out there is just so profound that the likelihood of anybody finding anything out about me except the fact that I'm in Latvia and there's probably an empty apartment in my place back in London, so that's really going to be the limit of what anybody finds out about me. And it's, by the way, it's not empty. My neighbours are using it, so if you're online...
And you have a big dog.
That's what everybody watching the direct you London thieves. Okay, the next question.
Robert Dahlsjö, Swedish Defence Research. The Arab Spring can be seen as people power 2.0. And we saw that in 1990. And in some cases, like the Philippines, it worked. And in some cases, like China and Burma, it didn't. And a precondition for successful use of non-violence might be that your opponent has some sense of decency. Your opponent, his henchmen, or his backers. Because a regime that can, like China or Burma did, kill thousands of opponents may have the means to overcome the power mobilized by social media. Any comments?
Of course, you know, the Chinese example you mentioned is very clear that they didn't care about human rights, and the international community could not pressure them. And it looks also that this nascent opposition movement was not strong enough all over China to make a difference. I mentioned to a Syrian example in 1982, they did the same, and they got away with it because there was no CNN, there was no international media, no Al Jazeera. Of course, the presence of media would highlight it and would mobilize more people. So more people in Syria today are mobilized because they see on international TV what is happening in their own country. I would wait until the conditions in China and other places are mature enough and ready enough for anything like that. I mean, to go from dissenting and building a negative public opinion through social media against your own government, and then there is the second step, which is rebellion. This is a big time, and it takes a lot of organization. And once you have the organization, you will have the rebellion, but not yet. I don't see the conditions are ready.
Yes.
And also, I don't think anyone in the Libyan opposition would consider that Muammar Gaddafi or his sons had any sense of decency, yet they were managed to overcome him.
The force came from the regime. It was not from the people from the beginning. And in fact, if you remember, in the Syrian case, when it started, Al Jazeera did not cover it. And so the people, the opposition, were all the time complaining why Al Jazeera is not covering the Syrian, as if they are letting him get away with it. And so they began to cover it. And that increased the degree of resistance and protest and widened the protest inside Syria because the coverage is there and people can watch it.
Sergei Kizima from Republic of Belarus. We see that at the moment European economies have a lot of problems. The same is for United States of America. We have talks about new depression and so on. And we know that the reason is new rising economies with the same technologies but with less price for working force. And we see prediction of Bloomberg that in 10 years the size of economy of United States will be the same as the size of economy of China. And in 20 years, Bloomberg predicted that the size of economy of China will be double compared to economy of United States. India is on the rise, Brazil, and so on, so on, so on. So world is changing, and within 20 years it will be a lot of changes in world politics and world economy. At the same time, we know that Hillary Clinton has organized some programs how to use social media against governments that America don't like and want to change them. So is it possible, that's my question to American representative, is it possible that America will finance programs that in 15-20 years will be used against American government and against European governments?
Who will finance these programs? I'm sorry?
But social mass media programs and technical means that will be created for governments that America don't like at the moment. In 15 or 20 years will be used again American government and the government of European Union governments, countries.
Well, I can't really get into a hypothetical about what's going to happen in 15 or 20 years with the use of the internet or cyber warfare, et cetera. I don't know if other people want to speculate, but I would say that our goal is not to be using the internet or social media as a tool against anybody. It's to increase access to these tools for people who want to use them for positive purposes, and to increase freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of assembly online, which we think is a progression in the fundamental freedoms that we've always tried to preserve.
Are you going to run some education programs in using social media?
Well, we do use, we do foster all kinds of education using social media and technological tools as part of Secretary Clinton's 21st Century Statecraft Initiative. We partner with private sector, nonprofit organizations, as well as others who are within government who are very technically savvy to work with civil society organizations to help give them the tools to use social media as well as other technologies more effectively. We are actively trying to develop and fund research and development for all kinds of tools that we think will be helpful in the fight against internet repression. We do training in cyber defense to help activists and journalists understand what threats are out there, as well as how to protect themselves. So we do a whole host of things, I think, working with civil society, bringing people not just from the government, but from outside the government, to work with people around the world to help, I think, further our agenda here.
Okay. Next question.
General Klaus Wittmann, Aspen Institute, Germany. I wanted to come back to Mr. Boyer's offer to also say a few words about WikiLeaks. I think you awaited that urgently.
I don't know if I would say urgently, but I did expect the question. A few things to say about WikiLeaks. First, I think it's really important for folks to remember that the whole WikiLeaks episode began with an act of theft. And it's no different when it's done online to if it were somebody breaking into the State Department or any other government agency and stealing documents and carrying them out in a briefcase. And up till now, our legal concern and focus has been on that act. Obviously, there are a lot of people out there who believe that somehow the theft was justified because governments should be 100% transparent and have everything that they do out in the open for everybody to see. But we obviously disagree with that. I disagree with that. We couldn't do the work we do in terms of protecting our citizens, promoting human rights and democracy around the world if everything we did had to be out in the open. We work with journalists, we work with activists, we work with other citizens who are trying to work with us to expose wrongdoings of repressive governments. It's really dangerous work. And if they didn't have any belief that those interactions would be confidential, I think that we couldn't do the work that we do, and we're putting those lives at risk. So, in the end, obviously we criticized WikiLeaks for what they did because we don't think we didn't think it was the right thing to do. We thought they're putting lives at risk. They're hurting our ability to work as diplomats and doing the kind of work that we do. But I think that that's part of the public debate. One other point on this is that I don't think that what we expect within government is much different than what the expectation would be for any portion of society. I don't know any business or organization that could operate if they couldn't keep some information confidential. I don't know how media organizations and journalists could operate if they couldn't have confidential sources, if businesses had to put out there all of their client data online for people to see, social security numbers, etc. Obviously, if you're in part of government, you have to err on the side of openness and access, but I don't think that that means that you have to have 100% everything out in the open for everybody to see, or you can't do your work.
Yeah.
As an amateur historian, I find WikiLeaks fascinating because it reveals a great deal that will be interesting in the future to see how things really function. As a former diplomat, I find it very uncomfortable because I think it does inhibit diplomatic communication, and I agree here with Spencer that I think there needs to be certain areas of classified or information. But just as a human being, what disturbs me the most is when WikiLeaks revealed the list of high security facilities around the world that were critical to U.S. security. And they included places like a Danish insulin factory, an anti-snake venom company in Australia. And what struck me was that they were identifying objects that perhaps even terrorists were unaware of that suddenly became targets for terrorism. And that's the part of it that disturbed me, was that aspect of it, when you start getting into revealing information, that is in fact dangerous and endangers lives.
I mean, how many people in Australia know about the anti-venin clinics?
They do now.
We all knew about them. Anybody who grew up in Australia knows that when you go walking in the bush, you're likely to be bitten by a snake. And every child learns how to treat a snake bite. And we all know that all of the clinics in Australia have anti-venin. We all know in Australia. So unless you're going to get rid of 20 million people, then I don't think... I think what's extraordinary about WikiLeaks is just how boring it all is. There's very little in any of the reports. If you've actually read them, and I doubt whether there are many people who've managed to do so, most of them are hideously dull. I think Julian Assange is a bit of a tosser, but personally, but I think WikiLeaks and OpenLeaks have done marvellous things, because personally, I think that you need to have more transparency, not less, if you're trying to create an integrated economic society. Then the more information that we are prepared to release about each other, the less bureaucratic we become, and the more likelihood is that we engender trust. My opinion.
I mean, just because the fact that most of the documents were boring doesn't, I think, excuse the act and the basic concept that governments have the right to keep some material confidential if they feel that it was going to put people's security at risk and prohibit their ability to further, I think, good causes such as promoting human rights and democracy. Another example is, if you're a government and you're working, the United States, we work with countries in the former Soviet Union in terms of securing loose nuclear material. Should that be out there for terrorist groups to see? I don't think we can say, well, everybody knows where it is anyway. It's, there are plenty of examples that one can give, and certainly have not read hundreds of thousands of cables, and I agree with you, a lot of them were, I think, in the end, we had lots of comments that, it shows that the U.S. government actually takes this work really seriously and writes good cables, but there were some damaging things that were released as well. So, obviously I agree with the concept that transparency and openness of government is incredibly important, and we try to err on the side of openness whenever we can, but it's not an absolute.
We have a couple of questions from the audience, but since we are talking about social media, I'm going to turn to the questions from Skype, and we have two that in a certain sense bear on things we've already talked about, but they really focus on the role of governments in manipulating organizations. And one is, isn't social media dangerous because governments and other organizations could use it with bad intentions to spread ideas? And the other is, isn't social media becoming more populistic? Can it result in populistic governments receiving more power? In other words, this question of accountability and of how do we make sure that that the information sort of is tested and that we can have some kind of trust in what we read on the internet and prevent it from being manipulated. You mentioned the Facebook pages. Maybe how did that work out?
Of course, we found that some strange Facebooks would emerge, pages, and they would try to mislead you as if they are against the government, but then you discover that those guys are really playing, just trying to lure you into the web, and so that they get information about you. Once you post something, they know your opinion, and then they will start knowing who you are. But of course, it was very difficult because it was a small unit in the electronic department in the Ministry of Interior, and they are overwhelmed. If you have 6 million people every day, each one just posts 2 to 3 posts, which is not true. Everybody posts 10, 15, 20. Imagine, and some are posting not in Arabic, but also in English and French and German. You need an army to translate and to see what is that. So it was not really an easy task. Many emerged and tried to make such pages here and there, and they had the trolling technique also that was being done. The only way you can tell if this is true or not true, if they are fake or not fake, is you see this information, had it been posted somewhere else in other reliable sources, are they credible or not? You have to do that on your own and discuss it with some of your trusted friends. Otherwise, it's difficult. Sometimes we get people, sending you a request ad friend. Some, for the men would be really loving when you get Angelina Jolie is sending you add me. And you just say, wow, Angelina Jolie, well, why does she care about me? But of course...
You mean her little minion somewhere that is added?
Yeah, exactly.
It's not her.
And sometimes it's security. They are just fake accounts, and they put, or even not a celebrity, some pretty lady sending you, I want to be your friend. Of course, you'll be happy. And but if you add her, you are in trouble, because those people are not, it's a detective. It's not a woman, it's a detective. And they just put nice pictures and stuff like that, and some people get caught.
Social media are not dangerous. Behaviour is dangerous. Behaviour needs to change. We need to educate our communities. There was a question earlier about whether the US government was going to actually support education campaigns. Really, it's the responsibility of every single government to educate their own people in terms of behaviour online. Social media themselves are just there. It's the behaviour that matters.
I completely agree. I mean, I think that just as with people, with rights come responsibilities. Governments have responsibilities. We have the right to bear arms in the United States. It doesn't give us the right to go into some town square and shoot up people. We have freedom of expression, but we have laws against libel and inciting imminent violence, slander, and so forth. And just as we support being able to have free access to the internet, doesn't mean that we support people or governments using it either as a tool of repression or to further criminal activity.
Okay. I have 2 more questions, and then if anybody else, we have time for maybe one more after that. Okay, so.
Thank you, Paul. Airis Rikvēlis, I'm Director of Strategic Communications, Minister of Defense of Latvia. I have a short comment and then a question. It's actually interesting to see here that while we are talking about impact of social media on the political regimes, and basically it means about politicians and decision-making of politicians, there's hardly any politician left in this room. So I hope they're all watching this panel on the internet. But my question is that it seems to me that we are all here very optimistic about the impact of social media on our political developments, and we all like how social media is acting when we are bringing down tyrants and dictatorships. And since this panel is about process, basically about the impact of social media as a process on political regimes, I would be interested to hear your thoughts about how far we will go with this development of social media, and where are the limits of this age of social media unbound, and whether all of that is just a positive impact of social media in the political process. And maybe not so much talking about dictatorships. There's almost everything clear, but particularly on impact in democratic societies. Thank you.
So,
just one short comment. Since I'm a politician, I'm maybe the last one here. And if I get reelected, this is an issue that I will continue to look at. But I think the key here is education. I think, like with any other issue, I mean, electricity isn't dangerous unless you misuse it. Same thing with social media. And I think here the key is to help people understand how it can be used, how it can be abused. Not so much to control it or ban it, but to make people more informed and more educated, just like we're trying to do in political choices or safe driving. It's partially a government's responsibility, it's partially the media's responsibility. Investigative journalists can help the public understand how media is being used to manipulate their thoughts. And I think the more informed people are, the better defended they are in dealing with it.
I'll just use this moment as an opportunity to talk a little bit about how social media has changed in countries that aren't repressive or afraid of being toppled and so forth. I mean, I think it's changed the way a lot of governments work. I mean, it's certainly changed the way we work in terms of looking at communication more as a two-way street. We've obviously always been about trying to connect and bring people together and so forth, but certainly social media, social networking has made that even more pronounced. You know, I would say probably in the past there might have been more of an emphasis on creating the perfect message and thinking of it as more of a one-way street and who are you getting it out to, et cetera, where now there's much more of a focus on distribution channels, you know, information networks, figuring out sort of what people are saying, where, and so forth, in order for us to have better policy and to connect better. So, you know, as time goes on, I'm sure that will continue, you know, to be the case, that we, you know, look at, you know, creating more opportunities for dialogue and having social media help us as a government understand what people are thinking, how they're thinking, what they're saying it, where they're saying it, so that we can develop better policy.
Okay, question here.
Neringa Weisberde from Lithuania. I used to work for NATO's public diplomacy. Social media became popular as a media of protest. And what's your take on how social media can be better used by governments or by non-governmental actors for a positive political action? So for action for, not for action against.
Getting people to engage. I mean, effectively, there's still
to mobilize people for good cause, not for action only against.
There's still at this stage very few governments that are prepared to actually accept information from these channels. They're not actually opening up the channels. They're not actually providing access. So what they can do is provide a platform where people can engage on public interest ideals. That's giving access is the best thing that governments can do. At the moment, and it comes back to the education thing that we've both been talking about, it is the fact that governments at this stage, I got a tweet earlier saying that the Prime Minister of Finland, who was here, has a Twitter account with nothing in it. You know, I mean, that's the sort of, okay, you're providing a platform, they won't necessarily come unless you start doing something, you know, provide a basis for people to interact with you. Don't just sit there and pretend that it's going to, oh, well, they're going to use Facebook to talk to me about, you know, the rights of women in societies in India, I don't know. So unless you actually give people a context for engagement, you can't actually get them to engage.
Ojārs?
A couple of weeks ago, a yacht overturned on the north shore of Latvia, and the captain was missing, and a reporter tweeted out that to anyone in the area to try to see if he could find him. And the rest of us retweeted this message. Now, this is something the government could also do in cases of emergency, blood donations, where you need public involvement. I think government agencies can use Facebook, can use the Twitter. I know that the Latvian Institute now is trying to develop a Facebook page. They've discovered that countries cannot have Facebook pages, something they're trying to overcome. But I think government agencies more and more should use these media not just to promote individuals or promote what they're doing, but actually communicate with people and engage them to, especially in cases where they need public help.
And I just might note that there's a legislation in the Latvian parliament right now allowing people to initiate legislation in the parliament through their internet bank accounts. You can put a piece of legislation on the web, and if you support that and you get 10,000 people liking it, you know, identifiable people through their internet bank accounts, then that will go as a piece of legislation to Parliament if this bill is passed.
Just to echo the point I was making before in terms of governments using social media and social media and new technology to greater effect, you know, I think it's one that looking at it more as a two-way street and a way to get better information about people that you're trying to help, that you're working with. But two, I think that it's important to empower what we call digital natives. There are lots of people in government who have a real sense of how to use these new technologies effectively, and it's not always the 50-year-old communications director in a particular place. You know, I'm 42 and I'm learning a lot from some of my younger colleagues in terms of how to use social media and other technology effectively. So I think that governments having a more broad approach, having in some senses, you know, greater ability to take in information and ideas from all of the great people around them, and then fostering an environment that people can experiment and try new things without risk of failure, or if it doesn't come out exactly as they chose. I mean, so much of the innovation that we've seen through social media and new technology over the last decade has been through people trying things and maybe not succeeding at first. So you have to create that culture. One of the things that came out of, I think, that culture is with the Haiti earthquake. We had some very innovative young people at our State Department who came up with this Text Haiti campaign, where within a very short period of time, people were able to use their cell phones to text to a number Haiti and contribute automatically, and within, you know, a short period of time raised over I think $30 million, but you know, a great accomplishment and a lot of money in a short period of time that I don't think would have happened if people didn't feel free to experiment and give ideas.
Since the revolution, you know, the new rulers of Egypt began to use Facebook that overthrew the regime. So the generals in Egypt have a page on Facebook, and they use it to put communiques every now and then to the people through Facebook. The Prime Minister, the caretaking government, also has a Facebook page. They put some of the resolutions, and they look at the commentaries that are coming from the people who post you know, comments and reactions. So that shows you, you know, how governments began to learn, especially if they had been stung by the Facebook.
Thank you. And for the last question?
Yes, I have Vegos Walits. I'm the European Affairs Department at the Riga Southern University. I have a comment to Johan and then a question as well. First of all, Johan, you said that Jyrki Katainen, the Finnish Prime Minister, doesn't even have an account. I would say that, okay, there are many ministers who don't have an account, but at the same time, for example, Carl Bildt from Sweden or Alexander Stubb from Finland have their accounts and they've been very successful. So I would argue there's a certain kind of division of labor. Or what I would argue is that if we look back about 200 years ago in European history, then the reason why the public media rose was that it was in opposition to the official media, which was provided by the traditional monarchies. So in a way, social media is a response to the traditional media outlet of the ruling classes. This is the comment. But the question is, I'm not so much worried about the social media in whatever form it is. But my concern is, which I remember 5-6 years ago in Washington, D.C., when we discussed about what is the quality of the comments on the newspaper commentaries. Because, for example, in my own country, in Latvia, I see that there is a tremendous problem, at least as I consider that people don't really understand what means to evaluate, because the thing is that if news outlets don't make a distinction between IP addresses, then it's a possibility for the certain outlets to create the commentaries in favor of one or other sources. And therefore, I believe that if there is a possibility to distinguish between the commentaries and between the produced commentaries, I believe it would be certain achievements. So therefore, my question is: do you certainly do you consider that simply commentaries are all right, or do you think that there should be certain qualitative evaluation needed for the commentaries in the news portals, for example? Thank you.
Yes, short answer. I think that there should be, where in a news portal in particular, where a commentary is created by someone who is either an expert in the field or is an authorised journalist, I think they should be a verified account. And I think that the advantage of that is twofold. First of all, yeah, you're getting the right information. But secondly, you're also ensuring that there's accountability of those staff. If they come on board as an anonymous commenter and create something, there is the perception that this has come from the field. It's really important that they actually identify themselves. And by the way, when I was talking about the Finnish Prime Minister, I'm not saying that this is across the board. There are some great people with great accounts. It's just that why create an account and leave it empty?
Just one comment. When a minister like Carl Bildt is actually writing his tweets, I think it's great, and I follow it too. But you have other ministers or mayors who have hired PR people sitting there and writing those tweets all day. And then the question is that real? Is that relevant? Is that good? If it's basically an artificial tweet, then it's like speechwriters.
Yeah, but some of them are more articulate than the people who are doing the accounts.
As a former copywriter, I know what you mean.
Okay. Well, thank you very much to the panel. I think we've had a fascinating discussion. To wrap this up, I have to say, this doesn't even date me because it's before my time, but there was a saying in the 60s in the feminist movement that the personal is political. And I think in this discussion, we felt that intensely, that talking about social media, which we all use, and talking about their role in social change and our involvement in politics, we're all thinking about ourselves at the same time we're thinking about Egypt and Tunisia and Belarus. Thank you very much to the panel. Thank you to the